This is Greek with David Hutchison. Genitive. The genitive case provides some of the most exegetically significant options in all of Greek. If there's one lesson to pay attention to, this one is it. If you think about the word of in English, it's extremely nuanced. In the same way, the genitive, which we translate sometimes with just that basic word of, the genitive is extremely flexible and nuanced and capable of a great deal of different meanings. The basic idea of a genitive case is a case of description or limitation or restriction. Kind of at its core, the genitive is similar to an adjective. If we had the phrase the Son of God, and the of God would be genitive, of God describes the Son, and it limits the Son. So whose Son are we talking about? Well, we're talking about God's Son. So you see that genitives can describe, they can limit, they can restrict. Some syntax volumes will have a basic category of genitive called Genitive of Description. All genitives, in a sense, are descriptive. What you want to try to do, if possible, is to be more specific. What more specifically is this genitive doing? If you can find something else, let's go for that. If you can't find something else, then kind of as a last resort, you could go with genitive of description. Genitives do normally modify nouns. When you have a noun that's followed by a genitive noun, we will refer to that first noun as the head noun. So the genitive noun is telling us something about the head noun. Normally, what's going to happen is that you have the head noun and then you have the genitive. That's your typical Greek word order. But sometimes you'll have the genitive preceding the head noun, and in that case it's a bit more emphatic. You can string together a whole series of genitives, and when that happens, a genitive is normally going to be dependent upon the genitive that precedes it. So you can basically treat it in left to right order. We've got a variety of main categories of usage. Since we have a number of big categories, I'm going to outline this a little bit more explicitly than we sometimes would. The first big category is going to be adjectival. These are genitives that function in some sort of an adjectival way. The next option is ablatival. If you remember back to when we introduced either a 5 or 8 case system, there are 5 cases based on form, 8 cases based on function. If you did an 8-case system, you would go with not just genitive but also ablative. This category consists of these genitives that express this idea of separation. That's the basic idea of an ablative. We'll also see some genitives that are related to a verbal noun. This one is going to be extremely important. Put a big giant star by this one when we're dealing with genitives related to a verbal noun. Some genitives can function in an adverbial sense. We'll see that. And then there are what some syntax volumes would call other uses of the genitive, and some would say this is genitive after certain words. What we're going to talk about here is genitive direct objects and genitive objects of prepositions, that sort of a thing. So let's go ahead and begin with adjectival genitives. So this is our big first large category. Within this large category, we're going to talk about possessive genitive, a genitive of relationship, an attributive genitive, a partitive genitive, genitive in simple apposition, genitive of apposition. Keep in mind when you study a syntax book, Some examples in the New Testament aren't going to be some of these main categories. They're going to be some of the more refined and nuanced categories that don't occur all that often. So you will need to keep your syntax book as a reference for times like that. So the possessive genitive. The genitive noun in a possessive genitive possesses the noun that it modifies. This is not necessarily literal possession. It doesn't have to be actual literal ownership. If you want to test this out, see if you can insert the words belonging to or possessed by. If so, then there's a good chance you have a possessive genitive. In English, we would say John's book or the book of John. This is the book that is owned by John. The servant of God, God's servant. So in Greek, ton doulon to archiereos, the slave, the servant, then here's the genitive, of the high priest. Well, whose slave is it? What's this idea of possession? So it's the high priest's slave. Autou ta otion, his ear. This one you see is fronted, and we would say probably for emphasis. So whose ear is it? It's his. Notice this is a pronoun that can often function in this sort of a sense. There's a subcategory of possessive genitive that we'll call genitive of relationship. This genitive is expressing some sort of a familial relationship. Could even be kind of a spiritual family, but it's expressing some sort of a relationship. One thing to note here is that the head noun will sometimes not explicitly appear in the text. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. So I might say Noah, comma, the son of David. Of David would express this relationship, this familial idea. Or Jenna, the wife of Garrett is expressing this relationship. So look at this example. Dawid ton tu Yesai. David, the of Jesse. David, the of Jesse. This is a typical type of structure. You don't have the word son explicitly stated. David ton huion tu Yesai. This is simply Dawid ton tu Yesai. So this would be an example of a genitive of relationship. David, the one of Jesse. Typically David, the son of Jesse. Sometimes, although this is less frequent than the son, but you could have Maria he to Clopa. Mary, the one of Clopas. In this case, context would show you this is Mary, the wife of Clopas. And remember, context is extremely important in all of life and certainly in Greek. So don't ignore context, and context will help you on these items. Next, let's take a look at an attributive genitive. Just like an attributive adjective that attributes a quality to a noun, the attributive genitive attributes a quality to the noun that it modifies. Basically, functioning like an attributive adjective, it's just a little bit more emphatic. Sometimes people will call this a Hebrew genitive. This is a typical Hebrew way of expressing something. Since the New Testament is heavily influenced by a Semitic background, you'll see this somewhat often. If you want to know if you have one of these attributive genitives, see if you can convert the genitive, instead of doing an of, see if you can convert it into an attributive adjective. We might have sons of disobedience. Well, let's try to convert that into an adjective. Could we say disobedient sons? So here's one from Luke. Hakrites tes adikias, the judge of unrighteousness. In other words, this is an unrighteous judge. You could have done that with an attributive adjective, but instead we have a noun in the genitive for this attributive genitive, a bit more emphatic. To chremati tes dunameos autou. By the word of his power. By the word of power. By the word of power. In other words, his powerful word. This example from Hebrews 1:3. So this is attributive genitive. The partitive genitive. You want to get this phrase exact, and you're going to have to think about this one. A partitive genitive denotes the whole of which the head noun is a part. It denotes the whole of which the head noun is a part. This will make more sense in just a moment. Such as some of the girls. The whole group would be girls, but the head noun is expressing some portion of that. So the genitive expresses the whole, the girls, of which the head noun, some, is a part. One of your sons. Sons expresses the whole group, and then the head noun is expressing some portion of it. A piece of pie. See if you can add the phrase, which is a part of, and you probably have a partitive genitive. Tenes ton grammateon. Some of the scribes. Some of the scribes. The genitive expresses the whole, the group of scribes, and then the head noun expresses some portion of that, some of the scribes. Ta decaton tes poleos. A tenth of the city. A tenth of the city. So this is partitive genitive. It expresses the whole of which the head noun is a part. Because the genitive is the part that expresses the whole, some syntax volumes will at least put in parentheses that this is a wholative genitive. WHOLATIVE, a wholative genitive. This terminology of partitive genitive is pretty typical, so you should definitely get used to it. We've seen before that nouns can function in simple apposition, and we did that with nominative, we did it with vocative. Today we do it with genitive. Later we'll do it with dative, and we'll do it with accusative. But a genitive noun can be in simple apposition to another genitive noun. This is just telling us something else about that noun, an additional designation. Remember when we talked about convertible propositions, A equals B, B equals A? Simple apposition is that sort of a thing. See if you can add which is, who is, namely, but you couldn't add of. You couldn't add of. The story of David the son, the gospel of Paul the apostle. These would be simple apposition. Edon ta paidion meta Marias tes metras autou. They saw the child with Mary, his mother. Metras is in simple apposition to Marias. Charis human, grace to you, kai irene, in peace, apatheu patras hemon, from God our Father. From whom? From God. Further designation, patros, from God our Father. Genitive in simple apposition. Now let's distinguish simple apposition from genitive of apposition. With simple apposition, we said it had to be a genitive in simple apposition to another genitive. This usage could be to any case. The difference, though, is that there's not an exact equation. It's not an A equals B, B equals A sort of a thing. So it's not a convertible proposition. The head noun will describe a larger category, and then the genitive will give a particular example. And sometimes when you have this sort of a thing, the head noun is a bit difficult to understand. It's a bit ambiguous. It might need to be explained. And so the genitive serves to give that further explanation. you'll see this sometimes called ep-exegetical. This is a big old fancy word that means it's further descriptive, further explanatory. To test if you have genitive of apposition, see if you can add which is or who is or namely. And then if you add the word of, it doesn't change the meaning. The land of Egypt, the sign of circumcision. Let's look at this one in Greek. Kai semeion elemen peritomes. And he received the sign of circumcision. In other words, he received the sign which is circumcision. He received the sign. What is the sign? Well, let's have some further explanation. It's circumcision. Notice here we did add the word of, and the meaning was not changed. That was different from simple apposition. Tous logus tes propheteas, the words of the prophecy. All right, so let's look now at the ablatival genitives. Remember, this is a genitive with the idea of separation. So we'll look first at a genitive of separation, kind of this core ablative idea, and then we'll also look at a genitive of comparison. And you're going to get some good help here because you're going to have a comparative adjective plus a genitive. So this genitive of separation. The genitive of separation expresses the idea of separation from a verb or from a head noun, and this separation could be literal separation. It might simply be figurative. This is not extremely common in Koine Greek, but I do think it's important enough that it deserves to be mentioned. So what was happening in classical Greek, you would do more things like this where you simply use the case by itself to express some nuance. But remember what happened. Alexander the Great conquers the world. He conquers by might. He keeps it through culture. One way you keep through culture is with the language. And so what happens when you have all these non-Greeks learning Greek is that the language becomes more explicit. So instead of this fine little nuance, languages will do something like using a specific preposition to express the nuance. So the prepositions apa or ek start to be used. So you don't see this a whole ton in the New Testament. See if you can insert the word from or away from, and you may have a genitive of separation. Keep away from drugs. Stay clear of sexual immorality. Be separate from all these things. Here's one from Acts 15. This was the Jerusalem Council decision. Apekesthai edolathuton, kai haimetos, kai nikton, kai porneus. To abstain, and then here's all these genitives of separation, from idle meat, and from blood, and from things strangled, and from immoral sex. Be separate from these things. Or here's one from 1 Timothy 4. Apostasantai tenes tes pisteos. Some will depart tes pisteos, from the faith. They will separate themselves from the faith. This next one under this ablatival idea is a genitive of comparison, and in some grammars they'll put it in an adverbial section. But basically, if you have a comparative adjective, then you have a genitive. Basically, it's just doing better than such and such, greater than such and such, taller than such and such. This is just how you do it. Use comparative adjective plus genitive. So you'll see that comparative adjective and throw in the word than. If it makes good sense, you have a genitive of comparison. John is faster than Fred. You can see why translating it John is faster of Fred wouldn't make sense in context. Nobody is wiser than God. Comparative adjective, then the genitive. Remember, a comparative adjective is the ER type of form, and then the EST the superlative. But so here we're talking about a genitive of comparison. We've got a comparative adjective. Ta moron tu theu, sa photeron ton anthropon estin. The foolishness of God, were that even possible, it is wiser than men. The comparative adjective, sa photeron, and then the genitive. Here's one from 1 John. Meidzon estin ha theos tes cardias hemon. God is greater, the word meidzon, greater than our heart. You wouldn't say God is greater of our heart. God is greater than our heart. Comparative adjective plus genitive. All right, now verbal genitives. Again, this is extremely important. Very much exegetical significance to be had here. Couple of different categories here, plus one combo category. We're going to talk about a subjective genitive and an objective genitive. And then the debatable category is the both and, the plenary genitive. In other words, the full genitive, both subjective and objective. So here's what we're talking about. These are genitives that modify nouns with a verbal sense. So the noun that the genitive is modifying has some sort of a verbal sense. And then the question is the genitive doing the action of the verb, or is it receiving the action of the verb? So we might say, I play for the love of the game. The love of the game. The word love is a verbal noun. If you can convert the noun into a verb, can you love? Can you do that? Yes. What this sentence is saying is that I play because I love the game. It's pretty clearly not saying that the game loves me, but here I love the game. So loving the game, love of the game, it's the object of the verbal idea in the word love. So that one is pretty clear. How about this one though? There is nothing quite like the love of a woman. This one is capable of a couple of different meanings. You could be saying there's nothing quite like loving a woman. You meet a girl, you get married, and there's just nothing like loving her. In that case, of a woman would be the object of the love. But it's also possible that same exact phrase, you could be saying there's nothing like when a woman loves you. There's nothing like the love of a woman. That one would be subjective because the woman would be doing the action of the verbal noun. So depending on context and depending upon nuances of words, it is possible that you could have quite a different meaning. So let's look at this subjective genitive. So the genitive is modifying a verbal noun. That's a noun that has a verbal idea. And the genitive is acting as the subject of that verbal idea. The genitive noun is doing the action of that verbal noun. The head noun has to have this verbal idea, or else we can't have one of these verbal genitives. So to test it out, try to convert the noun, the head noun, into a verb and make the genitive noun its subject. Thank God for the rule of Christ in our lives. What you're saying is, thank God that Christ rules in our lives. Christ is the subject of the verbal idea in the word rule. So Christ is doing the ruling. You're certainly not saying, thank God that you rule over Christ. We speak about the faith of Paul. What you're saying is that Paul is the one who expresses this faith. Paul expresses this believing. So Paul is doing the verbal idea. Matthew chapter 24, part of the eschatological discourse. And by the way, the main point here is be prepared, be ready. You have to be ready now. You don't know when the Son is coming, so you got to be ready now. Hutos estai he parousia tu huiou tu anthropou. So shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So the head noun is the coming, he parousia, and then the Son is doing the coming, so we would say tu huiou is a subjective genitive. The Son of Man is doing the coming. Or Romans 8. Tis hemas korisse apates agapes tu Christou. Who, possibly what, will separate us from the love of Christ? Is it talking about the fact that Christ loves us? Who can separate us from that? Or is it talking about our love for Christ? Well, it's talking about Christ's love for us. Christ is doing the loving. Christ is the subject of the verbal idea in the word love. So now let's look at some objective genitives. With this, the genitive noun is the object of that verbal noun. It receives the action. And again, the head noun has to have an implicit verbal idea. So what you do is you try to convert that head noun into a verb and convert the genitive into its object. You might be able to add the words for, about, concerning, towards, or against. If we had the phrase God's condemnation of the heathen, in other words, God condemns the heathen are the ones receiving the condemnation. Heathen is the object of that verbal noun, condemnation. Abstain from the love of money. We're not talking about money loving you, we're talking about loving money. So this would be an objective genitive. He de tu pneumatos blasphemia uk aphethesetai. But the of the Spirit blasphemy will not be forgiven. The of the Spirit blasphemy. Here, of the Spirit is fronted for more emphasis. It's in between. You have article, then de. The de of the Spirit blasphemy. Little article sandwich there. But the blasphemy of the Spirit will not be forgiven. We're not talking about the Spirit doing the blaspheming. That would be subjective. But we're talking about blaspheming the Spirit. So this is an objective genitive. Uai humen tois pharisaios, hati par erkesthe tain chrisen, kai tain agapein tu theu. Woe to you, Pharisees, for you have neglected justice and love for God. So the word God is the object of the verbal idea, love. In this discussion of verbal genitives, is the genitive doing the action or receiving the action? There have been significant discussions about a particular phrase in Paul. It's pistis Jesu, the faith or faithfulness of Jesus. Now I put it here in the exact genitive form that it appears, pisteos Jesu Christou. So for example, Romans 3:22, dikaiosune de theu dia pisteos Jesu Christou. If we translate this, a righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ, through faithing Jesus Christ, the head noun, the verbal idea is faithing, believing. The object of that faith would be Jesus, so we would call that one an objective genitive. This is a typical way to understand Paul's argument here in Romans, and I think it is correct. But another way to take it is as a subjective genitive or possibly even a possessive genitive. So here we're not talking about believing in Jesus at this particular point in the text, but we're talking about Jesus's pistis, Jesus's faithfulness. So part of the nuance here is that the word pistis can either mean faith or it can mean faithfulness. And then if it can mean either of these things, are we doing subjective or objective genitive? So with a subjective type of reading, Jesus is the one expressing the pistis. Jesus is the one expressing the faith or the faithfulness. So if Jesus is doing this faithfulness, it's subjective, or you might even say possessive. If it's faithing Jesus, believing Jesus, it's objective. And so you can see how this could be a pretty important discussion. Some people will argue that when you try to decide between a subjective genitive and an objective genitive, sometimes the author really had both in mind. This is a debatable category, but I think it really works at least a few times. The author is intentionally making a statement that's going to cause you to think, but it really is not one or the other, but it's a both and. So in 2 Corinthians 5, Paul says, the love of Christ constrains us. Are we talking about Christ's love for us? This is what constrains us, this is what compels us? Or is it the fact that we love Christ? Well, maybe it's both. If it's both, you would call it a plenary genitive. Another one I think is definitely plenary. Revelation 1:1. Apocalypsis Jesu Christou ein edoken auto ha theos. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him. Is Jesus doing the revealing? Or is this a revealing about Jesus? Well, in the book of Revelation, it's both. And so we could take this as a plenary genitive, saying that this revelation is about Jesus Christ, objective, and Jesus is doing the revealing, the unveiling, the disclosing, subjective. Now to our fourth main category, adverbial genitives. Here we want to look at the genitive of time and something called Genitive Absolute. If you can think of any other type of verbal idea, genitives can do that sort of a thing. So we could discuss genitives of place, genitive of impersonal means, something impersonal by which you accomplish something, personal agency, the person who's accomplishing something, and other adverbial types of ideas. But we'll limit it simply to genitive of time and genitive absolute. But again, know that sometimes you're going to need to compare syntax volumes to look at other options for a particular text. Genitive of time. Why are we going to discuss this one? Well, because you can express time in Greek in three cases. You can do genitive, or you can do dative, or you can do accusative. So I do want to make a comment about when genitive is used. The genitive is used to express the kind of time, or time within which something takes place. The dative, on the other hand, will be a point in time, 11:32. Accusative would be extent of time, duration of time. So when we do genitive of time, we're doing kind of time, or time within which. See if you can add the words during, at, or within. John 3, talking about Jesus and Nicodemus. Eilthen pros auton nuktos. He came to him during the night, at the night kind of a time. He didn't want to come during the day. He wanted to come during a secret type of time, a night type of time. So what kind of time did he come? That's why we're expressing genitive. If he came at 2:42 a.m., would have said dative. Nestuo dis tu sabbatu. I fast twice during the week. And by the way, this word Sabbath can either be a particular day, Sabbath, or refer to a whole week. And in one place, at least, it refers to both in the same verse. That's something to file away for when we do word studies. Then a genitive absolute. What you have with a genitive absolute is you've got a participle. It's an adverbial participle. You need to have a subject of that participial idea that's different than the subject of the main verb. Okay, so let's say that again. You've got a participle. You need a subject of that participial idea that's different than the subject of the main verb. So what will happen is the participle is going to be genitive, and the quote-unquote subject of that participle is going to be genitive. So as you know, a regular subject of a verb would be nominative, and usually adverbial participles are very frequently nominative. But if I need a different subject than the subject of the main verb, it's going to go in the genitive. So look at this example from Matthew. Tauta autou laluntas. Autou is genitive. The participle laluntas is genitive. And then over here we have archon, heis, elthon, pros ekune auto. So in the main clause, we have a ruler bowed down. An archon, pros ekune. So a ruler bowed down. But what we have in the genitive part, this genitive absolute, this participial phrase, we've got a different person performing the participle. So while he was speaking, while he was saying these things, so we need a different subject than the subject of the main verb. So we're going to put the subject in the genitive, and we're going to put the participle in the genitive. And what the word absolute means is it's having been loosed. It's having been loosed from normal boundaries or constraints. And so we've got a different type of way of expressing this sort of thing. So this is a genitive absolute. It occurs with participles. And our last main category of usage is what some will call genitive after certain words, or other volumes will simply call other uses of the genitive. What we're talking about here is when a genitive can serve as a direct object, or when a genitive is an object of a preposition. So a genitive direct object, some verbs, just because of their lexical nuance, like to take an object in the genitive. Now the normal case for being an object is accusative, but some verbs, depending on their nuances, prefer to take a genitive object. These are verbs that may be verbs of sensation, emotion, volition, sharing, or ruling. Now, how are you going to know if a verb does this sort of a thing? All you really need to do is look it up in a lexicon. Look up the verb and see if it says with genitive object. So in this example from 1 Timothy 3, etis episkopes oregatai, kalou ergu epithume. He desires a good work. He desires a noble work. So the verb is epithume, he desires. The noun ergu is genitive. He desires a work. We would have this genitive direct object because the verb desire likes to take this object in the genitive. So just look it up in the lexicon and see if it does that sort of a thing. And then, of course, we have the object of a preposition. Some prepositions take an object in genitive. Many do, of course. Now remember that when you have a preposition and then you have a noun that follows it, what you have to do to figure out what the preposition means is say, okay, so here's the preposition plus, and then what case. So look up preposition plus genitive to find the nuance. Some prepositions, you recall, only take one case. Some take two, some take three. So when you see that preposition, what you have to do is look up that preposition plus whatever case it's in. Here, what we're talking about now is that some prepositions can take an object in the genitive. So all you have to do is look up the preposition in the lexicon. You can see what the nuances are when it takes that case. And its syntactical function is simply genitive object of the preposition. Don't make your life harder by trying to assign some other nuance. Simply say genitive object of the preposition, and the nuances are determined by the lexicon.